Before we get started, I just want to give a special shout out to Billy Jensen, who is a fantastic true crime investigative journalist who wrote the article for LA Magazine called The Secret Life of Johnny Lewis. That article was used extensively in the making of this podcast. So thank you, Billy. Johnny Lewis was only 7 years old when he landed his first acting role. Granted, it was only a bit part in an obscure escalator safety video, but it was a start. From there, Johnny appeared in dozens of commercials, including with Pizza Hut, before someone recognized this kid has real talent, and he earned appearances on the hit TV shows Seventh Heaven, Malcolm in the Middle, and Drake and Josh, which were really big in the late 90s and early 2000s. In 2001, when Johnny was 18 years old, he had made enough money from acting that he was able to leave his parents' home in North Los Angeles and move into a new home right in Hollywood with a bunch of other up-and-coming actors and actresses. By 2006, when Johnny was 23 years old, he was riding high. He had landed several more big TV roles, like a recurring role in the show The OC, which was very popular in the 2000s. And in 2006, he was dating the mega pop star Katy Perry. And although their romance was relatively short, apparently it was very intense because Katy would go on to write 2 songs that were apparently about Johnny. But Johnny's real rise to stardom occurred 2 years later in 2008 when he was cast as the character Half-Sack on the critically acclaimed motorcycle drama Sons of Anarchy. While the show made him famous and fabulously wealthy, Johnny was growing concerned with the direction the show was taking. He felt like it was becoming too violent. Johnny liked reading poetry and studying philosophy and staying up late drinking tea and playing chess. He did not like acting out scenes of gratuitous violence. It just wasn't who he was. So after being on the show for 2 seasons very successfully, he was a very popular character. He went to the writers and said, "You gotta write me out of the script. I can't do this anymore." The writers were totally caught off guard and begged him to stay, but he had made up his mind, and so in 2009, his character was killed off. After leaving Sons of Anarchy, Johnny decided that he wasn't going to pursue any serious acting roles for the time being. Instead, he wanted to focus his time on writing his first novel, which was about this musical genius trying to make his way in the world. And so he started asking around to see if anybody he knew of a quiet place he could live and write out of. And his photographer said, "I think I know the place." It was called the Writer's Villa, and it was this beautiful house with 6 bedrooms for rent right outside of Hollywood. Over the years, it had become a sort of safe haven for up-and-coming actors and actresses still looking to land their big break. The reason it developed this reputation was because of the owner, Kathy Davis. She was this wonderful woman who really understood how difficult trying to break into Hollywood was for all these people that stayed at her house. And so she would look after them and make them food and offer them rides. And she would stay up late and listen to their frustrations and be a shoulder to cry on if they didn't get the part they wanted. Many of her tenants, who went on to be big Hollywood stars, would later attribute their success, at least in part, to the time they spent with Kathy at the villa, which they remembered as being therapeutic and soothing. Even though Johnny had already had his big break in the Sons of Anarchy, he loved the idea of living in such a peaceful place that seemed to cater to eccentric artists like himself. So in April of 2009, Johnny called Kathy and requested a room, and she said, "Absolutely, you can stay on the 2nd floor in the red suite." After moving in, Johnny would tell his friends that the writer's villa was just as amazing as he thought it was going to be. And Kathy specifically was just as wonderful as everyone said she was. He actually struck up a friendship with her almost immediately. Everything seemed to be going really well for Johnny in his life until a few months later, he found out his girlfriend, Diane, was pregnant. Although this totally screwed up his plans for his novel, Johnny was really excited about being a father, and so he decided to move out of the villa and in with Diane, who lived nearby, to help take care of their child. 9 months later, on April 6th, 2010, Diane gave birth to a healthy little girl named Culla May, and Johnny and Diane fell madly in love with her. But unfortunately, Johnny and Diane's love for each other faded quickly after becoming parents, and before long, Johnny had moved out and back in with his parents. Not long after that, Johnny and Diane became embroiled in this really vicious, long custody battle over Culla May, which ultimately Johnny lost, which was devastating for him. A few months later, in October of 2011, when Johnny was still living with his parents, he decided to take his motorcycle out and just go ride around and clear his head. And so he drove for about 2 hours to the west of LA out into the desert, where he lost control of his bike and he crashed. After getting to the hospital, his injuries were determined to be relatively minor, except they were concerned he might have a head injury. However, after testing negative for a concussion, he was said to be okay by doctors and he was sent home. but when he got home from the hospital, he was not okay. He was a totally different person. Johnny's father, Michael, immediately noticed the change in his son's behavior. He just started acting really weird and erratic, and his thoughts weren't always coherent, and he was really agitated all the time. It was just very obvious that something was off. And it made Michael wonder, perhaps my son did get a head injury from that motorcycle accident, and the doctors just missed it. And so Michael scheduled 2 separate MRIs for Johnny to go to, but for whatever reason, Johnny refused to go. Around this time, Johnny's friends began to notice his strange behavior when in December of that year, he was at an acting class and he began speaking in a vaguely British accent. And everybody in the class noticed it, and eventually someone said, hey, why are you doing that? And Johnny was like, what? And just kind of shrugged it off and acted like he wasn't doing that. A few weeks later, on the morning of January 3rd, 2012, Johnny was at his parents' house and he was sitting in the kitchen while his mom was making omelets, and Johnny just kind of abruptly says, I'm gonna go out for a walk. So he gets up, he's only got his pajamas on, no shoes on, he walks out the door, and as he's walking down the road, he gets maybe 10 or 15 feet away from his parents' house when he hears someone screaming, like they're screaming in distress, and he thinks it's coming from the apartment that was right next to his parents' house. And so he breaks into the apartment, but there's no one in the apartment, it's totally vacant. And so as he's in this apartment, wondering what's going on, the 2 men that owned the apartment, they came home and they see Johnny standing there, and they told him he had to leave immediately. And instead of leaving immediately, Johnny grabbed a nearby glass bottle and he charged at them and hit them both over the head with the bottle before they managed to restrain him and hold him down until the police showed up. Johnny claimed he was acting in self-defense, but the police didn't believe him, and so they charged him with trespassing, burglary, and assault with a deadly weapon, and they sent him to jail. When Johnny's father was finally able to come to the jail and bail his son out, it had been 8 days, and in those 8 days, Johnny had been moved from general population to a psych ward because he was banging his head against the inside of his cell, and at one point he had tried to jump off of a balcony, and he was just generally acting unhinged. And so when he was discharged, on his paperwork, a doctor at the jail had commented that he thought Johnny at one point must have had some sort of head injury that had made him act this way, and he was definitely suicidal. When Johnny got back to his parents' house, he was an absolute wreck. Physically, he had 2 black eyes and his face was all puffed up from the confrontation he had with those 2 men in the apartment. And emotionally, he was so distraught that he wouldn't let anyone in his family come near him. He just holed up in his room and just told everyone to stay away. He also became extremely sensitive to light, to the point where he was turning off all the lights in his parents' home, and then when they would eventually just turn them back on again, he would get agitated and turn them all off, and then finally he just disabled his parents' fuse box. But despite Johnny's obvious issues after coming home from jail, over the next few weeks, he did actually seem to be improving, to the point where at the end of January, so about a month after he came home from jail, his parents allowed him to move out and go live on his own in Santa Monica, California, about 30 minutes away. But as soon as he was living on his own, his troubles started again. On February 10th, so about a week after moving into this place in Santa Monica, he was arrested for punching some random stranger in the head outside of a yogurt shop. But he was ultimately released on $20,000 bail. A couple of days later, Johnny, fully clothed, just walked into the ocean, and when he was pulled out, he had to be brought to the hospital to be treated for hypothermia. A couple of days after getting out of the hospital, he was arrested again, this time for trying to break into a woman's apartment in Santa Monica. He claimed he thought it was his friend's apartment, but nobody believed him, so he was brought to jail and then released on bail again. After this second arrest in Santa Monica, Johnny's parents finally convinced him to go see a doctor about this potential head injury they thought he got from that 2011 motorcycle crash. Even though that jailhouse doc had suggested Johnny had a head injury, he had not officially diagnosed him. So Johnny needed another doctor to officially diagnose his head injury so they could begin to treat it. But the doctor Johnny wound up seeing did not suspect a head injury. Instead, he suspected schizophrenia or bipolar, which are 2 very serious mental disorders. And so he prescribed some medication to Johnny that would treat both of those disorders, and Johnny was on his way. Johnny refused to take the medication and refused to go see another doctor, and so his condition just continued to get worse. Johnny was still facing serious jail time for the break-in and assault against those 2 men in the apartment next to his parents' home, and so Johnny's lawyer was trying to get a deal done where Johnny would go to a mental health treatment facility for a year instead of going to jail for a year. But Johnny was so confident these charges would just get dropped and he'd be allowed to go back to his life and live the way he wanted to, that he fired his lawyer and he represented himself in court. but the charges were not dropped and he was sentenced to 1 year in prison. However, the jail he was sent to was so overcrowded, they reduced his sentence all the way down to only 6 weeks. When Johnny's father finally came to pick him up from prison on Friday, September 21st, 2012, Johnny was at an all-time low. Even though he'd only been in jail for 6 weeks instead of the year he was supposed to be there, it was clear that amount of time had done an enormous amount of damage to him. And so on the car ride home from prison, Johnny just kind of sheepishly asks his father, hey dad, would it be possible if you called Kathy Davis at the writer's villa and just see if there's any way I can move back in? And Michael's thinking to himself, I hadn't thought of that, but the writer's villa was the last place Johnny was when his life was still in order. It was probably the last place he was happy, and so he probably has attached a lot of fond memories to that place, and so that's a great place for him to go. And so as soon as they got home, Michael called Kathy Davis and explained the situation and said, is there any way he can stay there? And she said, absolutely, the red suite is still available. I'll go up and make the bed right now. I can't wait to see him. Johnny stayed with his parents that weekend, and then on Monday, September 24th, he packed up his stuff and he moved back into the villa. 2 days later, a 70-year-old man named Dan Blackburn, who was actually neighbors to the writer's villa property, he was looking out his front window at this man who was standing out in the road. He only had on jeans and red shoes, he had no shirt on, and he was very sweaty, and he was just kind of frantically pacing around the road, and he had never seen this guy before, and so he's just kind of poking out behind his curtain, watching him to see what he's going to do next. And after about 15 minutes of this kind of strange pacing in the road, this guy turns and walks directly towards Dan's property, goes right up to the front step and starts knocking on the door. Dan was definitely a little bit concerned, but he shut the curtain, he walked over to the door, and he looks out the people, and there's this guy standing there with bright blue eyes that are all wide, and he's looking at the people as if he can see through and see Dan, but he can't. And so Dan reaches down and he opens the door just a little bit and he looks out, and the guy outside looks at him and goes, "Hi, I'm John. I'm your new neighbor." It would turn out John was Johnny Lewis. And so Dan opened the door a little bit farther and he looks at him and he goes, "Hi, John. Nice to meet you." And before the two men could have any sort of conversation, Johnny just abruptly turned around and walked away. And so Dan is totally puzzled by this strange interaction he's just had with Johnny Lewis. And he's watching him as he just walks back to the road, he walks back over and goes inside the villa and disappears. And so Dan kind of shrugs it off, he shuts his door, locks it, and goes back to his morning routine. About 30 minutes later, Dan is doing his own thing in his house when he hears his wife outside screaming for him to come outside. And so Dan runs out the front door, he goes into his driveway, which is between his property and the writer's villa, and he sees his wife is standing on the driveway, horrified, pointing up towards the back of their house. And he looks down, and back near their back deck, Johnny Lewis, is standing on top of the guy that Dan and his wife had hired that day to paint their back deck. Johnny is just raining blows down on this guy. He's got a piece of wood too that he's hitting him with, and the worker is sitting there trying to shield himself. There's blood all over him, and Dan instinctively just runs over to Johnny. Johnny's not seen Dan at this point. Dan gets right up to him and he grabs him by the shoulder and he tries pulling Johnny off. He's screaming at Johnny to stop, but Johnny just seems totally unfazed. He's just destroying this worker. And so finally, after Dan yanks on Johnny hard enough, Johnny jumps up, turns around, and levels Dan square in the face. Dan falls to the ground, and when he looks up, Johnny is just standing over him, looking at him with no expression on his face. It's like he didn't know what he was going to do with Dan next, so he just stood there and stared at him. But Dan wasn't going to waste any time. He jumped up and he clocked Johnny square in the side of the head, but it had no effect on Johnny. He still just stared at Dan, completely expressionless. And so Dan grabbed a nearby lawn chair and practically broke it over the head of Johnny, but again, it had no effect on Johnny. He just stood there completely expressionless, staring at Dan. And so at this point, Dan just grabs the worker who can barely stand and he runs back down the driveway. He grabs his wife and they run towards the house to go inside. And the three of them manage to get inside the house. And as they're shutting the big heavy door, Johnny comes bounding up and he gets right in front and he jams his arm in the space between the door and the wall. So they can't close the door because it's getting stuck on his arm. And so all three of the adults inside, Dan, his wife, and the painter, are putting all of their weight on this huge wooden door onto Johnny's arm, and Johnny is just trying to grab them the whole time. And so finally, the three of them start raising the door and slamming it as hard as they can on Johnny's arm. And finally, after several hard blows to his arm, Johnny retracted his arm, and they were able to shut the door and lock it. And so at this point, Dan's wife and the painter ran around the house, closing every window, locking every door. Meanwhile, Dan went to the side window that looked out towards the writer's villa property, and he got his phone out and he called 911 as he's looking out the door looking for Johnny. And so after he tells 911 what's going on and he hangs up, Johnny suddenly just appears running down his driveway as if he's running back towards the back deck. But he stops almost right in front of Dan's window. He turns and he starts running towards the villa property. He jumps over a fence that's at least waist height, just jumps clear over it. And then he gets to this huge wooden fence that surrounded the entire villa property that was at least, 8, 9, 10 feet. And he very easily just jumps, grabs the top, and catapults himself right over the top and then disappeared inside of the villa. Within minutes, the police showed up and they went inside the villa and they could not believe what they found. Based on the evidence, this is what investigators believe happened. After Johnny, for the first time, walked up to Dan's property and awkwardly knocked on the door and said, "Hi, I'm John, I'm your new neighbor." After that, he turned around and Dan watched him as he left his property and made his way back and went inside the villa. Once Johnny got inside the villa, he made his way up to the second floor and he went into Kathy Davis's room where she was sitting. Now, Kathy most likely turned and saw Johnny standing in the doorway. He's got no shirt on, he's sweating, he looks totally crazed. She probably was not scared. Instead, her motherly instincts kicked in and she probably said, "Hey, are you okay? Can I help you? What's going on?" And as she probably stood up and made her way over to make sure he was okay, Johnny, for reasons no one understands, proceeded to beat and kick and strangle her. And then when she fell to the ground and was totally helpless, Johnny proceeded to either stomp on her skull repeatedly, or he hit her over the head repeatedly with a rusty hammer that was later found in his bedroom. But no matter how Johnny did it, he managed to severely fracture her skull, and that's what ultimately killed her. After killing Kathy, Johnny tracked down her beloved cat and killed the cat the same way. Afterwards, Johnny ran out of the villa, and that's when he spotted Dan's house painter just sitting outside, and he walked over to him and just began beating him. And just like the attack on Kathy and her cat, this attack on this house painter appeared to have no motive as well. After Dan came outside and managed to fight Johnny off, and then when Dan went back inside the house with his wife and with the painter, Johnny stood outside for a few minutes before running down Dan's driveway and then hopping over those two fences right in front of Dan, and then Johnny disappeared inside of the villa. Once Johnny was in the villa, it's believed he climbed up to the upper patio or onto the roof of the villa itself, and from there he either jumped or fell to his death on the driveway below. His death was officially ruled an accident, not a suicide. After the news broke about what had happened at the writer's villa, everybody assumed Johnny must have been on some really hardcore drugs. That's the only explanation for why someone would act the way he acted. But when his toxicology report came back, it showed he had absolutely no drugs of any kind, legal or illegal, in his system. He was completely sober at the time he committed this horrible crime. Some believe Johnny really did have some undiagnosed head injury from that motorcycle accident, and this head injury is responsible for his violent outbursts. Others disagree and say the head injury had nothing to do with it. Johnny clearly had some undiagnosed mental disorder. Maybe it was schizophrenia, maybe he was bipolar, maybe it was something else, but it was this mental disorder that led to these violent outbursts. But to this day, no one knows for sure why Johnny did what he did. All we know is an innocent woman and her cat were needlessly killed. The next and final story of today's episode is called "This Demon Still Lives Among Us." In early 1974, 31-year-old Michael Taylor was living happily with his wife Christine and their 5 children in Ossett, which is a small town in central England. Michael was described as a great father and a great husband who had an excellent sense of humor. In fact, neighbors, whenever they would walk past the Taylor household, would say you could often hear the sound of Michael laughing or the sound of him telling jokes to his family. But in April of that year, everything changed for the Taylor family. Michael had been doing some home repairs when he fell off of a ladder and he hurt his back. The injury itself was fairly minor, but it resulted in chronic pain, and this chronic pain quickly changed how Michael behaved. Michael went from being this cheerful, funny, happy guy to being sad and depressed, and he was so irritable that his family could barely be around him because he would lash out at them. Now, the Taylor family was not a religious family. However, most families who lived in Ossett at that time were. And so when one of Michael's friends found out about how poorly Michael was doing, they approached Michael and said, you really ought to turn to religion for help and for guidance in this difficult time. And they also told him specifically that he really ought to check out this one particular Christian group. It was called the Christian Fellowship Group, and all it was a prayer group for Christians who wanted more religious support beyond just going to church on Sundays. But this friend of Michael's told him that the real draw of this group was the group's leader. Her name was Marie Robinson, and she was this 21-year-old, extremely friendly and energetic and charismatic person who just had this incredible way of making all of her members really feel like they belonged. And so Michael's friend was telling him that he really thought Marie could be the difference maker for him, that she could help him get back to normal. And so Michael, he trusted this friend, and he really didn't have much to lose at this point. He was already at rock bottom, and so he agrees to go check this group out. So on September 12th of that year, Michael makes his way to the church where this fellowship group is held. He goes inside and he makes his way to one of the back rooms in the church. And when he goes inside, he sees there's a ring of people sitting in a circle, about 20 people. And as soon as they see Michael coming in the room, they all stand up and they open their arms up. And they say, "Come on, come sit down with us. Welcome to the group." And then the woman who had to be Marie, she stands up and she looks at Michael, huge smile on her face, and she encourages him to come over and sit right next to me. "Welcome, we'd love to have you join our group." And so Michael, for the first time in ages, is smiling as he strides across the room and sits down right next to Marie. And then as Marie began to lead the group in prayer, Michael did not feel his chronic pain. He just felt happy again. But when the meeting was over and Michael went back home again, the pain and depression came flooding back. It was like the only place he could be happy was inside of the church at this fellowship group. And so over the next couple of weeks, Michael completely prioritized this group. He went to all of their meetings, and over the course of these couple of weeks, Michael became very close with Marie, and apparently Marie became very close with Michael, to the point where the two of them would stay after the meetings were over, and just those two would sequester themselves in quiet prayer. No one knew what they did in there, but it just seemed like they were developing a real relationship. And in fact, many people in this group suspected they were having an affair. And before long, the rumors in the church had spread outside and were all over Ossett. And then before long, Christine, Michael's wife, was hearing from a friend or a neighbor that apparently Michael was having an affair with Marie. Now, Christine had already suspected her husband was having an affair with Marie because Marie was the only thing Michael talked about when he got home. So on October 1st of that year, only a couple of weeks after Michael had first attended this group, Christine waited until Michael had left the house to head out to one of the group meetings, and then Christine hopped in her car and she followed him to the church. And when she got there, she parked her car, she took a deep breath, and then she got out, she made her way to the front doors of the church, and she stormed inside, and she found the room where these meetings were held. She barges in, and she points at her husband, and she says, "I know you're having an affair with Marie, and you're gonna admit it in front of this whole group." And Michael, who's sitting with his back to his wife in one of the chairs, he stands up, and instead of addressing his wife, who's accused him of infidelity, he turns and looks at Marie on the other side of the room. And when Marie made eye contact with Michael, she screamed. She would later say Michael did not look human. He looked like a beast and he had wild eyes. And so as Michael is standing there staring at Marie with this very aggressive face, he began breaking out in tongues. Speaking in tongues is where the speaker will be saying or uttering words or sounds that sound like language, but the speaker doesn't know what they mean. The idea is some entity has come inside of their body, and this entity is dictating their speech. And so Michael is broken out in tongues. He's barking these words and sounds at Marie, and everyone inside of the room has no idea what to make of this. Everything has happened so suddenly, and it's so surprising. You have the wife suddenly coming in and aggressively accusing her husband of cheating, and Michael is not responding to it, and he's acting totally crazy. And then before anyone can do anything, Michael goes from just barking in strange languages at Marie to suddenly rushing across the room as if he's going to attack her. And when he does that, the rest of the members jump on top of him and hold him down, and despite there being like 10 or 15 people holding him down, Michael is still trying to get up and he's screaming and snarling and yelling at Marie, and then Marie suddenly breaks out into tongues too, and it's only then that Michael stops trying to force himself up out of this pig pile that's on top of him, and instead he just continues to speak in tongues to her. And so the two of them are looking at each other speaking in tongues, and the rest of the group is just totally dumbfounded, and so they just begin praying. And then after about an hour, Michael just collapses. It's like he went unconscious. And at that point, everybody in the room just goes silent and they look at Michael. And then Michael kind of opens his eyes and it's almost like he's waking up and he begins looking around frantically, trying to figure out what had just happened. Michael would claim he had no memory of what had just happened to him. And so at this point, Marie would tell him and Christine that she believed Michael was possessed by a demonic force, and the only thing they could do at this point would be to perform an exorcism. An exorcism is an expulsion or attempted expulsion of a supposedly evil spirit inside of a person or a place. Michael and Christine were at a loss. They had no idea what to do in this situation. They were both kind of in shock for very different reasons, and so they just kind of deferred to Marie's judgment and said, yeah, I think an exorcism is the way to go. So Christine and Michael just leave the church and go home, and then the next morning, Marie would get in touch with the Anglican Church of England and would request an exorcism. And after hearing about what was going on with Michael, the Anglican Church would say, yeah, that does sound like he needs an exorcism. And so the following day, they would send out two of their best exorcists named Peter and Raymond. And so Peter and Raymond, they get to Ossett, they go to Michael's house, and they observe him, and very quickly they determine that it does seem like Michael is possessed by at least one demonic force. And so they tell Michael, the only thing we can do here is perform this exorcism, but we need you to agree to it. And so Michael says, okay, yeah, I agree to this exorcism, and so would his wife, because she at this point is just completely unsure what to do. She's just going along for the ride. So a day later, on October 4th at 10 p.m., Michael, his wife, and the rest of the members of this fellowship group, along with Peter and Raymond, they would all meet at this other church in a neighboring town. And as soon as Michael had been positioned in the middle of this group in this chair, Peter and Raymond began the ritual by praying. And as soon as they did, Michael began screaming out in tongues, and he began writhing around, and he fell to the ground, and he began contorting his body in grotesque positions, as if the words Peter and Raymond were saying were physically harming Michael. And so after 8 hours of this, during which they had to actually tie Michael down to prevent him from hurting other members or hurting himself, after 8 hours, they finally just came to a stop. Peter and Raymond were exhausted. It looked very much like Michael too was exhausted. And as soon as they stopped the ritual, Michael just kind of collapsed on the ground as if he had fallen unconscious. And then at some point he kind of wakes up and he's looking around wildly. He's still tied down to the ground and he's acting like he has no idea what's just happened. And at this point, Peter and Raymond, they tell him that, the exorcism was mostly successful. We identified 40 demons inside of you, and this exorcism was able to expel 37 of them. So that means there's still 3 demons inside of you. Now, we can't do it right now. We're too tired. You're too exhausted. So go home, get some rest, and tomorrow we will finish this exorcism. We will get rid of those 3 demons, and you will be just fine. And so Michael and Christine, they get their things and they leave the church and they head home. A few hours later, around noon, a woman who lived near where Michael Taylor and his family lived thought she heard something strange outside of her house. It sounded like someone yelling. And so she went to the front of the house and she pulled the curtain aside on one of her windows, and outside, walking down the street completely naked, covered in blood, was Michael Taylor, and he was saying something about Satan. And so this woman, she calls the police show up and they find Michael. He had curled up on the sidewalk outside of this woman's house and he was giggling like a child in the fetal position. And so the police approach him, and at some point Michael apparently snaps out of it and he starts looking up at the police like he has no idea what's going on. And eventually they would get him to tell them his name and where he lived. And so after calling in backup to deal with Michael, the responding officers made their way to Michael's residence. And so they go inside, and immediately, as soon as they see what's in there, one of the officers just turns around and runs outside and begins dry heaving. The inside of the Taylor family home would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in English history. A A few hours earlier, when Michael and his wife had come home from the exorcism, they had gone inside, and then Michael had fallen into one of his trances and began beating his wife. And then at some point, she fell to the ground and either was dead or was in the process of dying, at which point Michael jumped on top of her and using only his hands, he ripped her face off and flung it across the room. And then as she's laying there bleeding to death, he began rubbing her blood all over his body. And then after she had finally died, he tracked down the family dog and killed the dog as well. Fortunately, their 5 children were not home at the time of this attack, and so they were unharmed. During Michael's trial, the prosecution and the defense blamed the Anglican Church of England and Marie and her religious group for effectively convincing Michael he was possessed with demons, which caused him to act out violently and kill his wife. And so ultimately, Michael would be found not guilty by reason of insanity, and after only 4 years of psychiatric care, he was released. And today, he is still living free in Ossett. But despite the legal outcomes of this case, there are many people, both religious and not religious, who believe the Michael Taylor case is one of the only true demonic possession cases in modern history. Also, just to close the loop, we don't know for sure if Michael and Marie were having an affair, but it is assumed they were. On the late afternoon of December 11th, 2006, 30-year-old Rafaela Castagna glanced out the upstairs window of her condo that was located in the center of Erba, a small and well-to-do town in northern Italy. The weather had been beautiful all day, but since she needed to go out to the store to pick up a few things for dinner, she reflexively was looking outside to make sure the sun was still out. When she saw that it was, she turned around, grabbed her coat off of a nearby chair, and then walked into the kitchen to say a quick goodbye to her mother and her 2-year-old son, Yusuf. Her mother, 60-year-old Paolo Galli, was sitting in a chair next to little Yusuf, who was busy drawing pictures at the table with thick-colored crayons. Rafaela gave her son a kiss on the head and then asked her mom if there was anything she needed at the store since she'd be there anyways. Paula, who was an attractive woman with light brown hair pushed behind her ears, looked up for a minute from Yusuf's scribbles and told her daughter that maybe she should pick up some clementines and a little cake for Yusuf. And other than that, if Rafaela got the loaf of bread and bottle of wine along with the vegetables they'd need to make pasta that evening, they'd be all set. Rafaela smiled and nodded, and then thanked her mom for looking after Yusuf for a bit, and then she turned and headed towards the door of her condo, where she took a shopping bag from the hook off the wall and slipped it over her shoulder. After calling out a final goodbye to her mom and son, Rafaela stepped outside of her apartment onto a narrow balcony that stretched the length of their 3-room unit. To her left was the stairway that led both down to the cobblestone courtyard below, and also there was a stairwell that went up to the attic apartment right above her condo, where Mr. and Mrs. Cherubini lived. Before heading for the stairs, Rafaela just walked forward and leaned up against the railing and surveyed the courtyard right in front of her. Her apartment was part of a very old complex of condo units clustered around this rectangular courtyard right in front of her where residents parked their cars. Some of the 7 buildings that made up this complex were 6 stories tall, while others were just 3 stories tall. Rafaela's apartment was located on the 2nd floor of one of the buildings that had 3 stories. It was a renovated farmhouse with pale stone walls that looked yellow in the afternoon sun. To her right, at the far end of the courtyard, was a gate that led out to a narrow road called Via Diaz that left the courtyard and wound around the outside of the condo complex and led down to the shops and restaurants in town. The single window in Yusuf's bedroom and the window in the master bedroom that Rafaela shared with her husband looked out over this road via Diaz, and Rafaela's son loved to stand at those windows hoping to catch a glimpse of a big truck as it drove by. From her perch on the balcony, Rafaela looked up and over the roofs of the condo in front of her. In the distance, she could see the purple outline of the Alps, the mountain range that separated her town from their neighbors, France to the east and Switzerland and Austria to the north. But like most of the other 16,000 or so inhabitants of Erba, Rafaela didn't really notice all the beautiful sights around her that made Erba and other small Italian towns popular to tourists. Instead, as she stood there at the balcony railing, all she could think about was just how happy she was now that her family had finally started speaking to each other again. For almost 3 years, ever since her relationship with her 25-year-old Tunisian husband, Azouz Marzouk, had started getting serious, her father and 2 brothers had basically stopped talking to her. Rafaela had always been more rebellious than her 2 brothers, and her family, who were all devout Catholics, had not been happy when she converted to Islam and married Azouz. But when Yusuf was born, Rafaela's mother saw just how much Azouz cared for the little boy, and it changed her mind about him. And in time, she fully accepted her daughter's life decisions, and from that point onward, she did her best to be the most supportive grandmother she could possibly be. And recently, Rafaela's father, Carlos, who owned a successful local furniture company, he had also finally started coming around too. And while of course this made Rafaela extremely happy, it was actually little Yusuf, with his dark hair and dark eyes and bright smile, who was the happiest about this new family dynamic, because he adored his grandparents, and his grandparents totally adored him. Recently, Yusuf's grandfather had sent some of his workers over to Rafaela's condo to install some soundproofing. This way, Yusuf could play on the floor of his bedroom with his beloved trucks and push toys without disturbing the neighbors. Yusuf was extremely pleased about this. At some point, Rafaela pushed herself up from the railing, she buttoned her coat, and then she walked down the stairs to the courtyard. As she left the courtyard and turned onto Via Diaz, heading for her favorite local market, Rafaela nodded and smiled at some of her neighbors who were also out for a walk. Rafaela enjoyed the chance to walk into town by herself, going as slowly or quickly as she wanted. She had recently landed a good part-time job at an assisted living community for the disabled, and while she loved the work, at times it could be so hectic that it was nice to get away and be alone whenever she could. After making the walk into town, Rafaela got the things she needed from the store, and then she began the walk back home. As she neared the gate that would take her back into the courtyard, Rafaela greeted and waved to a few more neighbors who looked like they were heading into town themselves. Rafaela felt like she knew everyone who lived in her apartment complex, from the friendly volunteer firefighter to the garbage collector and his tiny wife who cleaned houses for a living, to Mrs. Cherubini, who worked in sales, and her husband, 63-year-old Mr. Cherubini, who couldn't wait for his wife to retire. As Rafaela crossed the courtyard and began walking up the steps to her condo, she wondered what her neighbors thought of her when they saw her walk by. When she reached her door, she used her key and she opened it up, and then once she stepped inside, she called out to her mother and to Yusuf to let them know that she was home. Yusuf came pattering down the hallway to greet her. Rafaela scooped him up and gave him a kiss, and then while carrying her son and the groceries, she headed into the kitchen to see her mother. Once she was there, she and her mother chatted while they began preparing dinner, and while Yusuf giggled and ran around knocking over blocks and riding his scooter, the kitchen slowly filled with the smell of olive oil and fresh garlic. A little while later, at about 8:20 p.m. that night, 2 of Rafaela's neighbors were out for an evening walk. It was a clear night, and the temperature had dropped to a cool 45 degrees Fahrenheit. As the 2 men stepped out of the courtyard onto Via Diaz, they followed the road as it turned right and brought them right alongside the backside of the building that Rafaela's apartment was in. As the 2 men walked, one of them smelled smoke and looked up at the building right next to them, and they could see flames licking against the glass of one of the windows in Rafaela's apartment. After signaling the other neighbor to look up as well, they watched as the glass broke from the heat of the fire, and then smoke began pouring out into the night air. Both men immediately sprang into action. They turned around and they raced back into the courtyard, and as they ran, they pulled out their phones to call the fire department that was located just over a mile away. As they raced up the stairs and then reached the second-floor landing, they saw a very badly injured man laying on the ground right in front of them. The door to Rafaela's burning apartment was open, and the injured man was laying across the threshold. His head was inside the apartment, and his legs were outside on the landing. The 2 neighbors rushed over and grabbed the man's ankles and dragged him as far from the open door as they could. As they did, they heard a woman's scream coming from the attic apartment that was located directly above Rafaela's apartment. It was clear the upstairs apartment had caught fire as well. The injured man nodded his head helplessly towards the outside stairs that led up to this attic apartment, but when the 2 neighbors looked up at the 3rd floor and saw the apartment above, there was so much smoke and fire coming out of the windows that they knew it would have been suicide to try to go up there and save whoever was screaming. And so with no time to feel bad about that, the two neighbors turned their focus to the open doorway to Rafaela's apartment. One of the men stepped inside the very smoky apartment, and after taking only a few steps, he saw there was a woman lying motionless on the ground, and her skin and clothes were on fire. As the neighbors pulled her out onto the landing by her ankles and tried to extinguish the flames on her, they looked up and saw the fire inside of Rafaela's apartment had finally reached the front entryway. So the men knew that even if there were more people trapped inside of Rafaela's apartment, there was no way they could get to them. By the time the fire department arrived just minutes later, the terrible screaming in the attic apartment had stopped, and the two neighbors, who were now coughing and filthy, could see that the woman they had pulled from the apartment who had been on fire was 30-year-old Rafaela Castagna, and she was dead. As the firefighters and emergency medical personnel took over, the two neighbors who had done their best to save the people in the fire stumbled back down the stairs and out into the courtyard, shocked and horrified by what they had just seen and experienced. Meanwhile, both the courtyard and the street running alongside the back of the condo via Diaz were filling up with neighbors and curious bystanders. Some were taking pictures with their phones, but most just stared upward at the firefighters climbing up the ladder truck trying to make their way into the burning apartment. Once the fire was finally out, medical personnel and police went inside to see if anyone else had been in there, and unfortunately there had been. One by one, 3 more bodies were brought outside. The first was Rafaela's mother, Paula, who had been found halfway down the hallway that connected the entrance of the condo to the kitchen and living area. The second was the Castagna's 55-year-old neighbor, Mrs. Cherubini, who had been the woman screaming in the attic apartment. And the third and final stretcher that came out carried the small body of Rafaela's 2-year-old son, Yusuf. The only survivor, Mr. Cherubini, who had been pulled out onto the landing by the 2 men who first reported the blaze, he had been rushed to the hospital in the nearby city of Como, and it was unclear if he was going to survive. Late on the night of the fire, Rafaela's father learned the terrible news. In a voice so choked with tears that you could barely understand what he was saying, Carlos called Rafaela's 2 brothers and told them, "Your mother and sister and Yusuf, their neighbor, Mrs. Cherubini, they are dead. All 4 of them are dead." After the 4 bodies were loaded into ambulances and taken to the medical examiner's office, where a doctor would perform autopsies to determine the cause of death, police tried unsuccessfully to disperse the crowd of spectators in the courtyard and out on the road on the other side of the condo. So instead, police just used yellow tape to set up a clear perimeter around the burned-out apartment to at least keep people at a distance. As the police and arson investigators, who were dressed in full-body protective gear, started lugging lights and equipment into the ruined unit, the mood amongst the residents who were still gathered outside in the courtyard quickly turned from shock to concern. Neighbors began speculating about how the fire could have started and spread so quickly, and how none of the victims appeared to have even tried to escape or call for help. Soon, neighbors were wondering out loud if there was more to these tragic deaths than just an accidental house fire. But the police and other authority figures who were on scene were not speculating, and the 2 neighbors who had been first on the scene and who might have been able to give the residents more information, they were not there to answer any questions either, because they had gone to the police station to tell law enforcement what they had seen. But within 72 hours, the worst fears of the Castagna's neighbors were confirmed. The initial investigation by police and arson inspectors, along with an examination of the 4 bodies, revealed that the victims had actually been murdered and that the apartment had been set on fire to cover up evidence of what the Italian press had dubbed the Erba Massacre. In the initial police reconstruction of the crime, Mr. and Mrs. Cherubini, the Castagna's neighbors who lived above them in the attic apartment, they had likely smelled smoke and had rushed down the outside stairs from their apartment to the Castagna's to see if something was wrong. But once they reached that second-floor landing, the Cherubinis must have stumbled into the perpetrator who had just killed Rafaela, her mother, and Yusuf and set the fire and was now trying to flee. And so the murderer must have seen the Cherubinis and attacked, first striking Mr. Cherubini down, leaving him for dead in the doorway, and then chasing Mrs. Cherubini back up the stairs into her attic apartment, where the murderer attacked her too, leaving her trapped and incapacitated before the fire killed her. Given that the first body found inside of Rafaela's apartment was Rafaela, and that the door did not show any signs of a forced entry, police suspected that Rafaela must have recognized the perpetrator and opened the door for them. The only person who could confirm or deny any of these details was Mr. Cherubini, and while he had survived the attack, after reaching the hospital, he had fallen into a coma, and so he had not been able to tell police or anybody what had actually happened. After the news broke about the murders, the police flooded Rafaela's apartment complex and began interviewing everyone. Did the Castañas have any enemies? Did you see anyone strange walking around the apartment complex that night? Did you see any of the Castañas that night? And if so, what were they doing or who were they talking to? But even as investigators carried out these constant interviews with neighbors and continued sifting through all of the evidence in the burned-out apartment for clues to the killer's identity, the investigators' real attention was actually focused on Rafaela's husband, Azuz. He had not been home at the time of the fire, and his whereabouts were unknown. Police weren't the only ones to suspect Azuz. As everyone in Urba seemed to know, Rafaela's husband had only recently been released from prison that year under a mass pardon by the government. Azuz had been serving time for dealing drugs, and so the investigators and people in Urba were suspicious that his drug ties may have had something to do with the murders. And the Italian media seemed to think the same thing. And so they quickly began running these stories that more or less declared that Azuz was either involved in the murders or that he was the murderer. But it would turn out Azuz had a rock-solid alibi. Within a few days of the murders, Azuz arrived back in Urba from his parents' home in Tunisia, where he said he had been visiting at the time of the murders. He said as soon as he heard that his family had been killed, he jumped on a plane and headed back to Italy. But even with this rock-solid alibi, the police still felt like Azuz could be a suspect, but without any evidence to support this theory, they did have to start looking elsewhere. So without any other leads to chase down, investigators again turned to the Castañas' neighbors in hopes of finding any new information that could help them solve this case, which by now had become a major national media sensation. And when the police went back, for the most part, people had really nice things to say about the Castañas. But as police dug deeper and deeper and asked people more and more questions, they eventually started hearing about a feud that the Castañas had with their next-door neighbors, Olindo and his wife, Rosa. Olindo was a large, awkward, and shy man who left early each day for his job as a garbage collector, and Rosa was a tiny, dark-haired woman whose house-cleaning services were very much in demand. Now, when the police learned that this potential feud the Castañas had was with Olindo and Rosa, they almost didn't follow up because they had already spoken to this totally unassuming, quiet couple, and they learned that they were gone at the time of the fire and whenever the murders happened, and like everyone else, they had seemed very upset about what happened to the Castañas, and whatever issues they had with the Castañas had to be fairly minor. But at this point, the police had so little to go on, they decided they would follow up, and they would ask the middle-aged couple to come into the station for another round of questioning. And so the couple happily agreed, and before long, they were sitting in a room at the station, ready to talk about whatever the police wanted. And over the course of the subsequent conversation, this couple would tell a truly unbelievable story that would not only shock the police, it would shock the world. Based on their story and on subsequent evidence and testimony that their story helped uncover, the police were able to piece together almost exactly what happened to the victims. On December 11th, so the night of the attack, just before 8 p.m., which was a couple of hours after Rafaela had returned from the market and had made dinner with her mother while Yusuf played on the floor around them, two people walked up the outdoor flight of stairs that led to the second-floor landing where Rafaela's apartment was. To understand what happens next, you need to have an understanding of the layout of Rafaela's apartment. Once you step through the front door and you go into the apartment, you would be standing in the middle of a hallway that stretched out to the left and to the right. The longer part of the hallway ran off to the left towards the combination kitchen and the living room area at the far end of the unit. Between the front door and the living room kitchen area, there was another doorway on the right side of the hall that led into Yusuf's little bedroom. If you turned right when you first walked into the hallway after coming into the apartment, you would almost immediately come to a closed door that led into the master bedroom. At exactly 8 p.m., the two people got off the stairs on the second floor landing and came to a stop directly in front of Rafaela's apartment door. Once there, they each reached down and touched the outside of their coat pockets, confirming that what was supposed to be in there was still there. Then they each pulled rubber gloves from those pockets and spent a few moments pulling first one set of gloves onto each of their hands and then a second set. Once they were ready, one of these two people rang the doorbell, and then they both leaned forward a few inches, straining to hear the sound of footsteps coming towards the door so they would be prepared for when it opened. Less than a minute later, they heard Rafaela's voice on the other side of the door asking who was there. One of the two people out on the landing calmly identified themselves and gave their reason for being there. After just a moment's hesitation, Rafaela opened the door. Instantly, one of the two people on the balcony, who were the attackers, pulled a heavy metal bar with a sharpened tip out of their jacket pocket. They lunged forward and they delivered a savage blow to Rafaela's head. As soon as Rafaela fell to the floor, her attacker reached into their jacket pocket and pulled out a sharp kitchen knife. Then they rushed forward until they were standing directly over Rafaela, and they reached down and they slit her throat from ear to ear. As Rafaela grasped at her neck, trying to stop the blood that was now pouring out of her, her attacker proceeded to stab her 11 more times. After this, the two attackers stepped over Rafaela's body, and then they turned left and began walking down the long hallway toward the kitchen and living area. As they pushed aside a child's scooter and toy trucks, they came face to face with Rafaela's 60-year-old mother. Paula had left the living room couch where she was sitting next to her grandson and was calling out in a panicked voice to her daughter, asking what was going on. Without hesitation, the same attacker who had just savagely attacked Rafaela raised the same sharpened metal bar and swung it at Paula's head. But the grandmother put up a fight, raising her arms to shield herself from this blow before pushing the attackers as hard as she could back down the hallway. However, the two attackers eventually overpowered Paula and they knocked her to the floor. And as soon as she hit the ground, one of the attackers leaned down and made a deep slash across the woman's throat. At the same time that was happening, the other attacker stepped past Rafaela's mother and headed into the small living area where 2-year-old Yusuf, still dressed in his trousers, socks, and a brightly patterned top, sat too terrified to make a sound, alone on the small sofa. He watched as his murderer walked up to him, leaned forward, and with their weapon held in their left hand, they grabbed his shoulder, and then a moment later, they slid the point of the knife into the little boy's throat. With the entire family either dead or dying, the attackers turned and began walking back down the hallway back towards the front door. On their way, they poured lighter fluid on Paula and her daughter Rafaela. They also sprayed lighter fluid all over Yusuf's bedroom and the master bedroom. Then the attackers lit 3 separate fires around the apartment before heading for the front door. But as the attackers stepped out onto the second floor balcony, they heard footsteps pounding down the enclosed stairway right above them. It was Mr. and Mrs. Cherubini. They had indeed smelled smoke and they were coming down to help their neighbors. Taken by surprise, the attackers responded with immediate savage force. As one of the attackers slashed the throat of Mr. Cherubini, leaving him to bleed out where he fell, partway across the threshold of Rafaela's condo, the other attacker took off after Mrs. Cherubini, who had begun running, terrified, back up the steps to her attic apartment. By the time Mrs. Cherubini had managed to get back through the door of her own home, where police would find her dead, kneeling on the floor with her head in her hands, she had suffered 8 blows to the head and 34 stab wounds to her back and thighs. The only reason Mr. Cherubini did not die from this attack was because of a congenital malformation of his carotid artery that stopped him from bleeding out before emergency medical personnel had arrived and could take him to the hospital. By 8:15 p.m., the 2 killers had finished their work. They had stuffed their bloody gloves back into the pockets of their coats, they had gone back down the stairway that led into the courtyard, and they had disappeared. Just 5 minutes later, the two men who had been walking past Rafaela's apartment that evening along Via Diaz, they would look up and they would see flames and smoke starting to pour out of the second-story apartment window, and they would run back and discover the gruesome scene. The reason Olindo and Rosa's story was so shocking to police, and the reason it filled in all of these gaps about what happened, was because their story was actually just a detailed confession. The shy garbage collector and his tiny wife, who was obsessed with quiet and cleanliness, were the killers. Olindo confessed to killing Rafaela and her mother and slashing the throat of Mr. Cherubini. The details of Mrs. Cherubini's death are unclear, but Rosa would tell police that she remembered chasing Mrs. Cherubini back up the stairs, and as the terrified woman scrambled to get back into her apartment, Rosa recalled making an upward stab with her knife into the back of Mrs. Cherubini's thigh. As for little Yusuf, Rosa, showing no emotion, told police that she was the one who slit the boy's throat. When asked why they did this, Olindo and Rosa, who did not have children of their own, and who seemed not only socially withdrawn, but morbidly attached to one another, said that they could not stand the noise that their neighbors, the Castañas, made while going about their daily lives. And once Yusuf was born, the sound of him crying at night and playing with his toys and riding his scooter and sometimes screaming in toddler frustration was just too much for Rosa and her husband. According to a transcript of this confession, Rosa would say, "We just couldn't stand them anymore. He was always screaming and my head was exploding." Rosa and Olindo's issues with the Castañas came to a head on the afternoon of December 31st, 2005, roughly 1 year before the murders. On the second-floor landing right outside of Rafaela's apartment, Olindo and Rosa confronted Rafaela and her mother, Paula, about the noise coming from their apartment. And at some point during this confrontation, as Rosa swore and cussed out Rafaela, her husband, Olindo, wound up and hit Rafaela, knocking her to the floor, where she hit her head hard on the concrete. Before Rafaela could even get to her feet, Rosa and Olindo were hustling away back down the stairs, and as they did this, Rosa would call over her shoulder, "Do not dare report us or we will make you pay." But immediately after this assault, Rafaela contacted a lawyer and began talking about filing a complaint against the couple. Rafaela's father, Carlos, had tried to mediate a settlement between his daughter and this couple. He also had that soundproofing installed in Rafaela's apartment because he wanted his grandson, Yusuf, to be able to just keep playing like a little kid and not have anyone get mad about it. But nothing worked, and Olindo and Rosa continued to complain and cause problems. And so finally, not long before the murders occurred, Rafaela went ahead and filed a lawsuit against her neighbors. However, she did tell them she would drop it if they just paid her family 5,000 euros, or about $6,850. Furious and absolutely unwilling to pay, Olindo and Rosa decided that they would just have to murder the Castañas instead. On the night of the attack, so December 11th, 2006, when Rafaela came to the door and asked who was there, Rosa and Olindo called back and said that they were there to accept the terms of Rafaela's proposed monetary settlement, knowing full well, as soon as that door opened, they were going to murder Rafaela, they were going to murder her mother, her child, and anyone else who got in their way. After leaving the burning condo, Olindo and Rosa had gone back to their own home, disposed of their bloody gloves and weapons, they put their bloody clothes in the wash, they showered and dressed, and then they went out to a local restaurant, so it would appear that they had not been around when the crime was discovered. But as Rafaela knew from her own experience, there are no secrets in small towns, and after the murders were discovered, many neighbors noticed that Olindo and Rosa did not seem all that upset about these horrible murders that had taken place, and they didn't seem remotely scared about the idea that there could be a killer or killers still on the loose. So that, combined with the fact that everyone in the complex knew about Olindo and Rosa's feud with the victims, had led several neighbors to tip off police that maybe they should look into this unassuming couple. And when the case against Rafaela's husband, Azuz, fell apart because he was totally innocent and had an alibi, this is exactly what the police did. Although the killers would later withdraw their very detailed confessions, the details they provided to police, combined with the fact that Mr. Cherubini would eventually come out of his coma and he would positively identify Olindo and Rosa as his attackers, was enough to send the couple to trial on October 12, 2008, almost 2 years after the Yerba massacre. At their trial, the police would explain that they bugged Olindo and Rosa's home with listening devices shortly after neighbors had brought up their suspicions around this couple. And so within days of the murders, Rosa was overheard on one of these listening devices saying to Olindo, "See how peaceful it is now? We can finally sleep well." On November 26, 2008, Olindo and Rosa were found guilty of first-degree murder. They were each sentenced to life in prison, where for the first 3 years, they would spend every daylight hour in solitary confinement.
Thank you for taking the time to watch the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more content. Your support means a lot to us and helps us create more videos that you'll love. We appreciate your feedback and would love to hear your thoughts on the video. What did you like about it? What could we improve? Your feedback will help us create better content in the future. If you're interested in seeing more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. We post new videos every week, so you'll always have something new to watch. Once again, thank you for watching and supporting our channel. We hope to see you again soon. Smiling face.